done so far is thank you. So for her commitment to joining us virtually in lieu of our original plans to have her here with us physically. I also want to thank Brown's History Department for sponsoring this event, as well as the Center for Middle East Studies, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Africa Initiative for their co-sponsorship. In particular, I want to thank Cherry, Julissa, Dana, Barbara, Maria Luisa, and Isabel for their administrative support. So before I introduce Dr. Akgöz further, I want to provide some brief context for our gathering today. Dr. Akgöz's talk, Geographically Uneven, Historically Unaligned, Writing Labor History at the Margins of the Global, is the keynote lecture for a two-day workshop that Dr. Seth Rockman and I have organized here. The workshop, Labor and the Global South, Concept Theories and Histories, has brought together a dozen scholars to discuss the conceptual and theoretical provocations that labor histories from the Global South present to predominant historical frameworks. And those scholars are in this room. When Seth and I first began discussing this workshop, we could think of no better person to provide framing insights on the relationship between labor history and the geographies of capitalism than Dr. Akgöz. Dr. Akgöz is a historian of global labor history, political economy, and women and gender in the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. She is currently a research fellow at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. Her first book, In the Shadow of War and Empire, Industrialisation, Nation Building, and Working Class Politics in Turkey, offers a site-specific history of Ottoman and Turkish industrialization through the lens of the Bakırköy cloth factory. This factory was located in the, quote, Turkish Manchester, which is the name chosen by Ottoman industrialists for the complex they built in the 1840s in Istanbul. Dr. Akgöz provides a century-long look at this factory from the 1840s to the 1950s, and she does so by toggling between the micro level of the production floor and the macro level of state policy. Rather than treating the factory as a backdrop to some larger historical narrative, she attends to workers' concrete experiences at the point of production and treats the factory as a contact zone in which the circulations of capital, labor, and industrial expertise, as well as competing political economic imaginings, become visible. In addition to her monograph, she has published extensively on labor, gender, and factory floor management in journals such as the International Labor and Working Class History, International Review of Social History, and Labor History. She has also contributed numerous chapters to edited volumes. She is a member of the Editorial Committee of the International Review of Social History, the co-chair of the Labor Network of European Social Science History Conference, and the co-coordinator of Workplaces, Past and Present Working Group of the European Labor History Network. Alongside her academic work, Dr. Akgöz has been engaged in a variety of political projects, and in February 2017, she was forced to flee her home country, Turkey, due to her political activism. We are thrilled to have Dr. Akgöz with us here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice, for this wonderful introduction. First, I want to say how sorry I am that I couldn't join you in person today. Until last Monday, I was hospitalized with a severe cornea infection, the traces of which are still visible on my face. And my doctor has not allowed me to fly. That's why I'm joining you remotely today. And I'm really sad that I missed your papers and that I don't have the opportunity to meet you in person today. I owe a huge thanks to Seth and Alice, not only for the invitation, but also for their flexibility and support in arranging this Zoom meeting under these circumstances. My eye is still quite sensitive, so if you notice me making strange facial expressions or pausing briefly to tend to it, please ignore and bear with me. And also from time to time, I might look like I'm frowning because of the photosensitivity, but I promise I'm not annoyed. I'm genuinely happy to be with you tonight. So it's truly an honor to be speaking at Brown University, a highlight for any academic, really. But I will admit, when I was asked to address you as a global labor historian from the Global South, my feelings were a bit mixed. Of course, I felt excited, as global labor history is central to how I approach my work, and I love talking about global labor history. But at the same time, I felt a sense of unease because I have often found myself navigating the edges of this field, sometimes pushing its boundaries, other times slipping through them entirely. So it creates a certain productive tension in how I relate to the discipline, and it's from this perspective that I will approach my talk today. When I look back, I see that this tension has profoundly shaped my academic research. It has prompted me to reflect not only on the challenges within global labor history I experienced, but also on the very structure of the field itself. Global labor history, as you know, emphasizes the uneven geographies and unaligned histories of labor under capitalism. And what I've come to realize is that writing labor history is not so different. It's also shaped by its own uneven terrains and disjointed timelines. When I describe myself as a global labor historian, I sometimes feel that I don't fully fit the label. Even though I have spent, as Alice was mentioning, some years working at two key global labor history hubs in Europe, the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, where I did my PhD with myself van der Linden, and right now I'm also a research fellow there, and the Rework Center at Humboldt University in Berlin. So why this disconnect, you might ask, despite these institutional connections? For one, I specialize in industrial labor, a type of labor that global labor history claims has already received more than enough attention, a type of labor that is already passé, if you will. What is more, my research focuses on working class formation within national contexts, and I often use microhistorical and biographical methods to do so. And it's as if that weren't enough to secure my marginal status within the field, my empirical research is on the late Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey, a region that stubbornly resists neat categorization in global history frameworks, as I will explain in a moment. So today I want to build on my experience of navigating these uneasy, topical, and geographical boundaries, and I would like to explore how the themes of scale and scope in particular play out within the global labor history framework. I will examine the three core elements of the framework, global, labor, and history, and I will try to unpack how each shapes the discipline's boundaries, assumptions, and also exclusions. My talk will be divided into three parts, so without further ado, let's begin with the first one, which is a critical interrogation of the concept of the global south within global labor history. From its inception, global labor history has sought to break free from Eurocentric perspectives and broaden the horizons of labor history, both geographically and thematically. Geographically, global labor history has successfully expanded the scope of labor history beyond its traditional focus on Europe and North America. And one of its critical interventions has been to shift attention to the global south, highlighting its essential role in shaping global labor systems. And this shift not only brings underrepresented areas into the scholarly conversation, it also challenges the Eurocentric narrative that has long dominated labor history. Another important shift has been the challenge global labor history has brought to the rigid divisions between different forms of labor and different forms of labor control, such as slavery, contract work, and so-called free labor. The perspective has emphasized the ways these categories often overlap and influence each other, and showed how forms of labor are interconnected rather than neatly separated in history. And this thematic expansion has allowed the field to include a broader range of labor forms that had previously been marginalized within labor history. To understand these expansions, however, it is important to recognize that global labor history's emergence over 3 decades ago paralleled a broader epistemic shift that highlighted the global interconnectedness of power, capital, and labor. And a key aspect of this epistemic shift involved rethinking geographic semantics, particularly in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this epistemic movement gained traction in the last decades, but it also left open questions about how we define, use, and sometimes contest terms like global and south in both academic and policy discussions. Today, the distinction between a wealthier, more powerful global north and a poorer, less powerful global south has become one of the most influential ways to categorize the world and understand global inequalities. The scholarly focus on the global south has exploded in recent years, and I was actually amazed to see the numbers when I was doing research for my talk, because according to the Scopus database, mentions of the global south increased from just one publication in 1994 to over 1,600 in 2020. However, the critical geographies of the global south seems to remain very much of a fragmented discussion now. Despite the widespread use of the term, global south is anything but straightforward, really, and it holds different meanings across disciplines with limited cross-communication among them. And I would argue that the concept polysemantics comes at a price. I will explain this in a moment. But before going into that, a quick survey across disciplines reveals three primary ways in which the global south is conceptualized. I would like to briefly discuss these. First, we have the geographical and socioeconomic marginalization under the term global south. And across social sciences, the term is often used as a shorthand for countries or communities seen as less developed, which reinforces a binary division between north and south or rich and poor. This framework, as you can imagine, frequently relies on quantitative measures like income levels to define development, tools that are widely used but also deeply contested. Now, you might think this kind of thinking is limited to policy circles or more data-driven fields, but it surprisingly extends into the humanities. For example, at the University of Cambridge, there's a research center called the Center for Research in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. In one of their current fellowship calls, I last checked 2 weeks ago, they define the Global South based on a list from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, based on a list from the OECD, which categorizes countries receiving official development assistance. This use of 8 classifications underscores how, even in fields with rich historical and cultural traditions, the Global South is still framed within economic and developmental indices. And then we have the Global South as a political and cross-regional alliance. Here, the term mainly refers to the intergovernmental alliances formed after the Second World War to challenge colonial powers and push for global cooperation. Key examples of this movement include the 1955 Bandung Conference, the 1961 Unaligned movement, and the 1964 Group of 77 at the United Nations. These efforts were rooted in anti-colonial resistance, but even in this context, the Global South concept still works within the frameworks of the nation state and modern political systems, as you can imagine. And then finally, we have the Global South as a metaphorical space of resistance, where it's often viewed as a space that challenges global power dynamics. Here, the term represents the dispossessed, reclaiming agency and resisting neoliberal capitalism even within the global north. And this conceptualization advocates for a post-colonial ethos of equality, mutuality, and collective subjectivity. And as a concept metaphor, it transcends geographic boundaries, symbolizing a spatially dispersed yet politically unified drive for resistance. Now, each of the 3 interpretations or conceptualizations of the Global South offers insights, but they also pose challenges for global labor history. The truth is, there is a noticeable gap in how the concept of the Global South is addressed within our framework. While the idea of the global has been explored in depth, what the Global South actually represents has not received as much attention. That being said, I think there is often an underlying assumption that the Global South in the global labor history framework is primarily defined by its colonial histories. Let me give you 2 examples. In one of the most prominent global labor history journals, only one article includes Global South in its title, and the authors of this 2014 piece define the Global South as, quote, the colonial and semi-colonial societies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that were once part of European empires, end of quote. The second example comes from the entry on global labor history in a 2023 handbook on the global political economy of work. Here, the author describes the global south as, quote, the poorer and historically colonized regions and people of the world, end of quote. So this way of framing the global south isn't just an academic issue, in my opinion. It has real consequences. Let me give you an example from my own experience. A few years ago, I applied for a position at a well-established North American university. I was rejected, but the story didn't end there. It actually began. A friend of mine who sat on the selection committee later revealed that the committee had been divided over whether Turkey belonged to the global south or not. I experienced variations of this in later applications, which made it clear to me how Turkey's historically complex geopolitics complicates its place in the binary frameworks of North and South. But this story, of course, isn't just about Turkey. Scholars from other regions, particularly those working on Eastern Europe, report similar frustrations often. They talk about a black hole created by the North-South binary. As one Eastern European scholar put it, quote, the first world became the North and the third world became the South. But what about the second world? End of quote. This absence is especially evident in global labor history, where Eastern Europe remains one of the least globalized areas of research. These examples point to deeper epistemic hierarchies that extend beyond the usual North-South divide. They reveal not just the dependency on northern frameworks of knowledge production, but also the difficulty of fitting regions like Eastern Europe or the Ottoman Empire or modern Turkey into such rigid categories. If contemporary global labor histories are still shaped by colonial topographies, what does that mean for those of us working on regions that resist easy categorization within these frameworks? Are we given the space to redefine global labor history on our own terms, or are we expected to simply represent our regions within the familiar language of global frameworks? And you might still ask, why does this matter, Görkem? What is at stake in these debates about classification? Why do you care so much who gets to be called a global labor historian? And my answer to that is this. Geographical semantics are not merely abstract epistemic categories. They shape concrete outcomes. And academics become invested with and carry with them the epistemic status of the locations they are seen to represent. This is particularly evident in the academic job market, where perceptions of one's geographical affiliation can influence the reception and impact of their work. In 2008, historian Sanjay Subramaniam explored this issue, arguing that academic branding often dictates the success of scholarly work. He argued that the branding of academic work often determines its success, and it creates a competitive environment where scholars must carefully navigate their identities and their affiliations. This is especially relevant to how global and global south are positioned within academic context today. The label global in particular holds power, in my opinion. It determines whose scholarship is considered essential to broader discourses and who gets access to key resources and networks. But paradoxically, it doesn't always benefit younger scholars. Last month, during an online roundtable on teaching global history, I learned about a survey conducted by the co-director of the Center for Global History at Oxford University. The survey revealed, quote, overriding skepticism toward the label global historian, end of quote. One concern stood out to me. Graduate students worried that this label could hinder their prospects when returning to work in non-Western academic contexts. So the perceived lack of local relevance or the perception of global as Western might be contributing to this skepticism. Either way, these examples demonstrate how branding deeply shapes the academic job market, often privileging those who fit neatly into established academic frameworks while marginalizing those who do not. And this imbalance has profound implications for how we understand epistemic hierarchies, geographical semantics, and the canon of global labor history. So after more than 3 decades of scholarship, what does this canon actually look like today? With this question, I now move to the second part of my talk. Global labor history often prioritizes large-scale, overarching perspectives over smaller, human-centered narratives. One example of this large-scale approach is the Global Collaboratory on the History of Labor Relations, developed at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, the home of global labor history's foundational work. This ambitious project aims to create a universal framework for understanding labor relations worldwide from 1500 to 2000 and categorizing them into structural types for comparative analysis. So quite a big endeavor, as you can imagine. While this kind of work has certainly expanded our field's reach, the emphasis on large-scale approaches often limits how global labor history defines what counts as global. Let me share another personal experience to illustrate this tension. A few years ago, I applied for a position as a gender and labor historian, preferably focused on conducting comparative research in 20th century. My proposed project focused on women's industrial labor in the Middle East and North Africa region, focusing on Egypt, Lebanon, and Turkey. After the interview, the head of the committee told me, "Great profile, but your research is not global enough." That comment left me wondering, how many square meters of land does a project need to cover to qualify as global? This anecdote highlights a critical tension in global labor history. While the field aims to challenge Eurocentric frameworks and explore interconnected histories, its focus on geographic expansiveness can sometimes overshadow the complexity and relevance of more nuanced thematic labor histories, even those covering larger regions like the Middle East and North Africa. To be honest with you, when I was proposing this project, I had hesitations. I thought it was too big and that they would find it like not doable. But as I said, it was not big enough in the end. So recently, labor historians have started to challenge this assumption that global labor history must always operate on large geographical scales. This has sparked critical conversations about what global really means in the context of global labor history. Does it refer to the sheer physical expanse of the research, or can a deeply focused study of a single site also qualify as global labor history? Marcel van der Linden, a pioneer of global labor history, actually argued that global labor history doesn't necessarily require vast geographical coverage, and this was like 2 decades ago almost. He wrote, "It's entirely feasible to study the history of a village, a workplace, or even a single family through a global lens." Yet this insight seems to have receded in prominence over time. Encouragingly, a new generation of scholars is reviving this approach now, and they are advocating for a synthesis of microhistory and global perspectives. Similarly, there is increasing critique of the field's preoccupation with mobility, sometimes referred to as a fetish of mobility. This focus often keeps global labor history centered on mobile sectors of labor, like migrant workers, seafarers, or other mobile forms of work, while neglecting more stationary but equally vital forms of labor. And industrial labor, I would argue, is one such overlooked category. From its inception, global labor history pushed back against what it saw as an overemphasis on organized labor and formal employment in industrial settings. This led to a proliferation of research into non-industrial forms of labor. And while this shift broadened the scope of research, it also came with some blind spots, including the almost total marginalization of industrial labor within the global labor history framework. I would argue that this marginalization is troubling at least for 2 reasons. First, industrial labor is far from disappearing. While factories may only make headlines during crises such as the Rana Plaza collapse or the Foxconn suicides, they remain significant sites of employment that are crucial to global capitalism. The relocation of industrial production has created more factory jobs in developing economies without entirely destroying them in the developed world. And furthermore, sectors like services, such as call centers, and logistics, such as warehouses, have adopted factory-like models where workers are highly regimented and their performance constantly measured against metrics. These conditions have sparked debates about whether these workplaces are today's satanic mills, as factories were called in the 18th century. Recently, I edited a review dossier on debates surrounding digital Taylorism, where new sites of digital work have been described as digital factories. And in this review dossier, we drew on global labor history, among other perspectives, to examine how technological changes have shaped labor and labor relations across time and regions. This is a very presentist debate, as you can imagine, yeah, this debate on digital labor. We highlighted the historical and global continuity in the emergence of heterogeneous labor regimes, and we tried to show that different forms of labor coexist and adapt within interconnected systems historically and in our present day, also under the rubric of digital work. So the invisibility of factories, I would argue, isn't because they have disappeared. It's because they have been pushed to the margins of research, despite their centrality to understanding global labor dynamics in the past and the present. And the second reason this marginalization, in my opinion, is troubling is the uneven distribution of scholarship on industrial labor between the global north and the global south. This imbalance stems largely from disparities in research resources, the complex politics of archival access, but also from the delayed arrival of the social history of labor in national historiographical contexts. By the time industrial work and the factory lost their allure for historians in the global north as keys to understanding capitalism, industrial workplaces in much of the global south had been studied only marginally. When I arrived first at the International Institute of Social History in 2007, I was shocked to hear that we did enough work on industrial labor and the industrial workplace, because from where I come from, we hadn't even started yet. And likewise, for many regions, the historiography of industrial labor is still stuck in state-centric and narrowly political narratives that lack the methodological depth found in social history. So this is where the challenge lies, I think. How do we reintegrate industrial labor into global labor history without falling back into outdated narratives? How can we balance the emphasis on mobility with the often overlooked realities of stationary yet transformative labor? And how do we ensure that industrial labor in the global south gets the attention it deserves, both in terms of scale and methodological depth? In my view, global labor history offers significant insights into industrial labor, especially in the global south. There are two key aspects I think are crucial. Its focus on interconnectedness and its interdisciplinary approach, something I believe is often overlooked but has great potential to deepen our understanding of labor's history. At its core, global labor history examines labor within the framework of transcontinental developments and their interconnections. This I call an epistemology of connectedness. And a classic example of this is the mechanization of the British textile industry, which not only reshaped local economies, but also sent ripples across the globe. Mechanization decimated manual weaving in Britain, fueled demand for cotton produced by enslaved labor in North America, and during the American Civil War caused a shift in cotton production to Egypt and India. Now, this ripple effect extended to the Ottoman Empire, which sought to industrialize in response to British dominance in manufacturing. In the 1840s, the Ottomans built an industrial complex along the Marmara Sea in Istanbul, and they famously called this complex the Turkish Manchester, a name that symbolized their ambition to match British manufacturing capabilities. Yet the Ottomans at that time weren't looking westward alone. Around the same time, Egypt's governor, Mohammed Ali Pasha, pursued an aggressive industrial modernization program, which posed both an opportunity and a threat to the Ottoman Empire. Both these efforts were tied into the European and regional histories, and their eventual failures deeply impacted Egypt and Turkey's political economies in the 20th century. So global labor history provided me with the framework to understand how these efforts, despite their shortcomings, were part of a much larger web of transnational connections. Despite falling short, these efforts led to a complex web of such connections. To begin with, Ottoman Istanbul became a hub where Scottish shipbuilders, Tunisian foremen, British and German engineers, Polish and Belgian directors, and even freed American slaves worked side by side. This interconnectedness persisted into the Republican era, shaping industrialization in Turkey well into the 20th century. For example, in my work on exilic German engineers in 1930s in Turkey, I uncovered deep ties to this Ottoman legacy of global connections. Similarly, in my book on industrialization and working class politics in late Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey, I treated this industrial complex as a contact zone, a dynamic transnational space where capital, labor, industrial expertise, and competing state visions intersected. Industrial workplaces, I came to argue, when viewed through this lens, are not isolated, stationary entities, but dynamic hubs of global interconnectedness. And in gaining this insight, I drew inspiration not only from the historical and geographical scope of global labor history, but also from its interdisciplinary potential. Although one of the strengths of global labor history lies in its commitment to interdisciplinarity, I think this potential remains underutilized. While there have been important strides, such as bridging the divide between the histories of slavery and wage labor, global labor history's ability to integrate perspective from fields like sociology, anthropology, and political science in other areas of labor history has often been overlooked. I think this is a missed opportunity because such interdisciplinary approaches can deepen our understanding of labor's complexities across time and space. In a piece on labor histories' survival strategies, historian of US labor Leon Fink observed that the disciplinary gates are open as never before. This observation resonates with my own experience at Rework in the past few years, the Global Labor History Research Center in Berlin. At Rework, I encountered a surprising disciplinary shift. As global labor historians were stepping away from the industrial workplace, anthropologists were stepping in. What I missed in the discussions with global labor historians, I was very happy to have found in my conversations with anthropologists of work. For instance, recent anthropological studies of industrial labor have emphasized the fragmentation of shop floors, meaning the unequal employment statuses between regular workers and contractors or casual laborers, often under the same roof. These studies also show how Taylorist methods, traditionally associated with rigid, hierarchical factory systems, can coexist with more flexible production arrangements, creating a mosaic of labor relations, sometimes extending into the space of home. This closely mirrors dynamics I have observed in my own historical research. Another area where anthropology has enriched the discussion for me is in tracing the global interconnectedness of local workplaces. By linking localized centers of production with wider global relationships and forces, anthropologists have shown how chains of production and consumption relate to industrial relations on the shop floor. This, in my mind, resonates beautifully with Lara Putnam's, historian of Americas, modern Americas, her concept of place-based research, which she defines as research guided by place in the sense of seeking multidimensional knowledge about a particular society. Putnam brings a grounded perspective to global history with this conceptualization, and she cautions us that we risk overemphasizing the importance of that which connects and underestimating the weight of that which is connected. So her insight points to a larger challenge in my mind: how global historians relate to the scholars and, crucially, the people who inhabit the regions they study. If global labor historians seek to ground their work in the lived experience of laborers, who better than anthropologists to help remind us of these real people and their stories? But what is the point of connecting the historical study of work with today's debates about social inequality and the growing precariousness of labor worldwide, you might ask? The relevance becomes clearer when we consider today's democratic crisis and the increasing scrutiny over how deindustrialization has been handled or mishandled. In many of these crisis narratives, the industrial workplace is often painted with nostalgia, seen as a golden age of stable employment and strong social protections, a kind of mecca of standard employment. But as the global labor history approach has shown us, this view doesn't hold up to historical scrutiny. Stable, full-time employment under capitalism, the so-called norm of the mid-20th century, was actually a historical anomaly. It was limited to certain regions, primarily the global north, and even there, it was a relatively brief period. More importantly, global labor history challenges the idea that labor flexibility and precarity are recent developments. Precarity, broadly understood, isn't just a byproduct of late capitalism. It's a defining feature of capitalist labor relations from the outset. And the historical study of the industrial workplace in the global south presents various similarities with the fragmented world of industrial work that we read from anthropologists today. The same uneven and combined development that characterized early industrial labor practices still shapes labor control and management in modern settings. And this is why an interdisciplinary approach is so important. By studying the fluidity and adaptability of capitalism at the point of production, we can better understand how these systems embed themselves in broader social contexts, extending into consumption and even social reproduction. The connections across time and space that such an approach highlights help us move beyond nostalgia and engage critically with the systems that shape labor and inequality today. Interdisciplinarity, then, is not merely a methodological option, but I think it's a vital approach that ensures labor historians remain nuanced, relevant, and connected to the societies they aim to eliminate. In the final part of my talk, I want to delve deeper into the themes of relevance and connection, reflecting on where we, as global labor historians, stand in terms of our relationship with public history today. But compared to the earlier sections, this part is more exploratory because I have only recently begun to think about this in depth, so bear with me. Public history is an expansive and multifaceted field. It includes museum exhibitions, documentary films, public lectures, historical reenactments, digital archives, podcasts, and community projects, all of which aim to bring historical narratives into public spaces in meaningful ways. But today I will focus specifically on labor museums, as I have recently had the chance to engage with professionals and researchers in this field. And my perspective on this topic is shaped by my experience with the museum scene and public discussions on history, particularly in Germany and to a lesser extent, the Netherlands. So the examples I will share are rooted in these two countries in the global north. So this part of the talk moves away from discussions of the global south. Last year, I gave the keynote at a conference at the Museum of Work in Hamburg. The conference brought together museum professionals and researchers to discuss how labor museums can incorporate global perspectives into their collections, research, and exhibitions. And a central question of the conference was how these museums could break free from national frameworks and embrace a more global context. This experience sparked a number of questions for me about the intersections of global labor history and public history, which I'd like to briefly share with you today. While preparing for my talk at the museum, I began by searching for references to labor museums in the global labor history scholarship, and I found almost nothing. This surprised me and prompted reflection on my years within the global labor history community, and despite the richness of our discussions, I realized we have rarely addressed the public dimension of our work in any focused, systematic way. So to what extent has global labor history's global orientation influenced its connection to public engagement? Now, some historians, and some surprising names actually, have claimed that proponents of global labor history tend to make the postmodern choice, their wording, of separating history from the reality they live in. I wouldn't go that far. For example, global labor historians have played a visible role in public discussions, such as their extensive contributions to debates around the formal apology for slavery in the Netherlands in recent years. Still, our engagement has been selective, and we often miss opportunities to contact with broader publics in meaningful ways, in my opinion. This became particularly clear to me as I immersed myself in the world of labor museums after my visit to the Museum of Work in Hamburg. I was impressed by the depth of research being conducted in museums, the richness of exhibitions, and the innovative work being done with industrial heritage trails. The debates among museum professionals about how to represent labor history were incredibly thought-provoking, and the fact that this vibrant field has been almost entirely neglected in our academic discussions was, quite frankly, an eye-opener for me. So looking for a broader framework to understand this disconnect, I turned to debates within global history to see what they do in terms of public history there. And here too, I found acknowledgement of a critical gap, the disconnect between the academic frameworks we use to conceptualize global history and the ways ordinary people around the world make sense of their own lives and struggles. Jeremy Edelman, director of the Global History Lab at Princeton University, captured this tension in a now famous question he posed back in 2017. He wrote, "In our fevered present of nation X first, or of resurgent ethno-nationalism, what is the point of recovering global pasts?" This tension is particularly relevant when we consider labor museums. Why? I'll try to explain. Labor museums are often deeply local institutions, situated in former factories, mines, workplaces, industrial districts, or workers' housing. They are typically founded by communities and local associations, often with the cooperation of former factory owners or workers. They rely on support from state and local governments, boards, and foundations. The question then is this: what happens to the mission of a local or regional museum when global perspectives are introduced? How can they expand their conceptual scope to include larger spatial scales, global connections, transnational flows, and broader histories, without alienating the local communities whose stories they are meant to preserve and honor? This is a delicate balancing act, and one that global labor historians need to engage with much more thoughtfully, in my opinion. Labor museums often address the challenge of global histories through the framework of decolonizing museums, often in direct relation to the colonial histories of the localities in which they are situated. Now, the questions of decolonization have been a topic of discussion in the museum sector since at least the 1970s. However, it was only in the 2010s that the idea of a post-colonial museology gained real momentum, emerging as a prominent theme across sector-wide consultations and practices. A compelling example of this shift is the 2020 exhibition Borderless: Colonialism, Industry, and Resistance at the Museum of Work in Hamburg. This exhibition played a key role in the city's ongoing reckoning with its colonial past and present. Hamburg's historical role as a hub of imperial trade and its industrial economy's ties to colonial exploitation formed the backdrop for an exhibition that explored the entangled histories of industry, labor, and resistance. And the exhibit not only highlighted how industrial labor built Hamburg's wealth, but also tied that wealth to colonial economies and the struggles of those whose labor was exploited. That said, this exhibition and the broader debates currently happening among labor museum practitioners raises important questions for global labor historians. For example, the director of the Museum of Work explained that museums focused on industry and technology often address, in her words, the very abstract and complex issue of globalization through temporary exhibitions. These topics rarely make it into permanent displays, she complains. In a private conversation I had with one of the curators of the Borderless exhibit, she shared her frustrations with me about the resistance from local museum stakeholders to update the museum's permanent exhibits along more global lines. It's clear that while the conversations in the museum world are evolving, the practical challenges of integrating global perspectives into established narratives are still significantly difficult. And second, as part of Borderless, the Museum of Work also hosted a conference that explored different perspectives on the post-colonial museum and its role in fostering critical conversations. What stood out to me about this conference was the absence of themes that are central to global labor history from the program. Topics like the diverse forms of labor across the globe or the historical development of global production networks. It seems that in their efforts to address difficult historical narratives, museum practitioners are focusing more on academic discussions around post-coloniality and decolonization. While these are important conversations, there is a noticeable gap between the work of global labor historians and the practices of labor museum professionals, despite sharing many common concerns and questions. And this gap to me reflects a larger challenge we face as a field. There is a risk that global labor history, while engaging deeply with transnational research, becomes too inward-looking, focused on refining its own frameworks rather than thinking about how our work can reach wider audiences or influence public understanding. In other words, there is a danger of our work becoming particularistic and self-referential, missing the chance to engage with the public and help shape how the history of labor, both past and present, is understood by broader communities. As I wrap up, I realize that trying to summarize everything I have covered might feel reductive, or let's be honest, a bit dull, given the scope I have covered tonight. So instead, I want to end by sharing a few reflections on what I personally would like to see more of in our discussions about global labor history in the future. First, I would love to hear more from younger scholars about their experiences navigating this field. For example, what does it mean to write labor history as a global labor historian when you are working with limited archives or fragmented records that only partially intersect with imperial histories? Or how does your own positionality, whether rooted in geography, identity, or academic training, shape the questions you feel empowered to ask in your research? How do epistemic hierarchies and geographical semantics influence not just academic careers, but the very kinds of knowledge that global labor history prioritizes? These reflections, I think, are essential if we are to broaden and challenge the spectrum of what is understood, labeled, or marketed as global history. Second, I think we need more focused discussions about how to balance local expertise and place-based research with global perspectives. As I argued earlier with the case of industrial labor, we shouldn't sideline certain topics or scales of analysis just because they might seem unfashionable. Instead, we should revisit them, weaving together the rich legacy of not just labor and social history, but also of related disciplines like the sociology and anthropology of work with the exciting insights global labor history offers. Sometimes it's the boring old topics that reveal the most unexpected insights. And finally, while we have done well to sidestep some of the methodological pitfalls of older labor history paradigms, we must hold on to one vital element of it, the vision of labor history as provocative public history. We need a more activist approach to how we write, produce, and present labor history to make it the kind of history that makes people want to act. And with this, I would like to conclude tonight and leave the floor to you. Thank you. I can't hear you, but yeah.
Yes, I think the floor is totally open for questions for Görkem. Why don't we, if there are a couple of people with questions, maybe we could take a few at a time, if that's all right with you? I think that's good. If we take a few at a time, if there are a few. Can you hear us?
Yeah, it's totally okay. Yes, sorry.
Okay. So are there any questions?
had a question, a comment, because I think that maybe before signing this, I thought it was so persuasive, but thank you very much for your talk.
I'm sorry, but I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Let's see if. Yeah, why don't you try now? I can also repeat the question.
Yeah, okay, hey, hi, hi. Thanks so much. I think that when we're silent, sometimes I feel like it's because, wow, we don't have any objections so far, what have you, or if maybe we're reluctant to say them. I don't know. I think it was a really fantastic talk. So I was just thinking about my daughter's is a landscape architect, and that might be another place to think about public history, because right now she's working with a community down in North Carolina, and they are working, it's mostly a Black community working on redoing plantation slave labor camp from the perspective not of the slaveholder, as most of these places are, but from the enslaved. And it seems to me that that's another great place, right, Seth, to think about the ways in which this is global, because the labor is kind of global. Where do the people come from, what they're doing, what they're producing for, and that's another way to bring this in terms of what we're thinking about. Not only just museums of work and labor per se of industry, but also agricultural labor.
Mm. Are we collecting more comments, questions, or?
People have gathered the courage to ask a question. Yes, nice have.
Can I come back?
Or shout, or I can say it for you.
Merhaba Görkem.
Merhaba.
Just very many thanks for this wonderful talk. I was wondering if any of the suggestions and criticisms you made, you have space, or you would think of a space to discuss the history of the left, where it is in all this global South labor history, even going back to the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire, even though we may not be able to conceive of a left in the 19th century. But I think, do you understand what I'm trying to say? The relationship of this as an academic discipline, as an activism you're inviting us into, and other connections with ethnography, anthropology. Where is the left, or has been the left historically?
I have a question after all. I have one, is that I totally understand and get your idea about the sort of reductiveness of a global South, global North, right? So what would you do what's another better term? I find myself struggling when I use these terms in my class.
Did you hear both of those questions?
Yeah, I mean, I did. Yeah. Should I
have-
try to answer, or?
We have one more question. We're gonna
Okay.
stop.
Sorry, I can't see everything very well. And if people can come to the
Come up
front
to you.
with questions, I would really appreciate that.
Okay. We have one more question, and it's from a familiar face, and then we'll take a second round in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll come put my big head right in the screen here.
Thank you.
Görkem, I think my colleague Naoko Shibusawa is exactly right. If there's any silence in this room, it's because we are just overawed by how thorough and complete and persuasive that talk was. That was a tour de force. So I just want to thank you for that. And the fact that you've done this under these circumstances is a true triumph. So thank you. I have a question about industrial labor and about industrial workplaces. And if you would be willing to share with us a little bit more thought about going into those spaces, perhaps as an anthropologist, with a sort of sensibility of an anthropologist of work, as someone who is thinking about human interactions with machinery, thinking about the sound, the noise, the tactile or embodied experiences of that labor. Are there new things that are coming into focus in the current scholarship about industrial labor and about factory spaces that have you particularly excited about future directions for the field, or about ways in which we can fulfill the agenda that you've set out to make this more public and more political?
Okay, why don't you go ahead and answer those and then we'll get some more.
Yeah, I'll try to do my best. I'm so sorry that I don't know your name, so I can't address you by your names. But like the first question or the comment, I would say it's fantastic. And the reason why I only talked about the museum scene tonight was number one, I really needed a focus to discuss public history because it's really huge. And as I said, like I actually do not work on this, but it was because of the invitation last year that I got really interested in this and really curious about this. And then I started like reading and collecting material, just, you know, like for fun, for my own interest. And I thought maybe it's like an interesting thing to talk about these things to you, like an audience in States. Maybe this is interesting for you to hear what is happening in labor museums in Western Europe. So in no sense I am arguing that like this is where we should be looking, this is where it should happen. On the contrary, I think it's wonderful that this kind of like public history, spatially they go like outside the physicality of buildings, and like the example that you gave, I think you said it was your daughter working on a plantation as a landscape. I think this is fantastic. There are also other examples that I know of, like for example, my friend and colleague Peter Cole in Chicago. He's doing a public history project that is dispersed into the city of Chicago about the radical history of Black workers there. So I think these things are like super important, super valuable, and we should be talking more about them. And I just find it problematic that we don't do that in global labor history discussions, at least not in the ones that I have been a part of so far. The question on the history of left, I am not sure if I can say much on that. That's like a really big topic, isn't it? And I mean, one of the criticisms of global labor history directed at the older forms of labor history has been that it has focused too much on the history of the labor movement. I mean, that's obviously not the left, but part of the left. So that kind of has been pushed aside, I think, in the global labor history framework as well. And I was actually reading something else the other day, a piece that harshly criticized the absence of trade unions in global labor history scholarship. And I was like, yeah, that's actually true. We should also problematize this as well. But I think your question goes beyond that, and I'm not sure if I can say anything meaningful about how to connect this to the history of left, and specifically in 19th century Ottoman Empire. About the better term question, if I understood you correctly, I think you asked if I can propose a better term than global South after all this critique that I brought to it. I think it's really important actually to keep the concept of the global South, if for nothing else, but because I can't come up with a new term. But I think we should think of it more as a relational category than a fixed label to begin with. And I think it helps us understand how historical processes of marginalization have shaped the global power structure we still deal with today. So I think it's very important to understand that the position of countries or communities, what have you, within the South isn't set in stone. I think this is exactly what this understanding of colonial topographies is doing. It's just a bit too static historically, if you ask me, because it shifts as global dynamics change, you know, what we call as global South. So it's not just about the colonial past. The term is still very relevant, I think, when we look at the ongoing inequalities we face today. But I want to say something, in my mind at least, kind of like connected to that. What we need to do, maybe instead of looking for a new term, what we need to do is really push for more South to South comparative and connected histories. And we hear that quite often, but I don't think we do that enough. We should do that instead of just sticking with the traditional North-South framework, because that framework often places the global north as the main reference point. And, you know, we should just do more south-to-south comparisons to challenge the usual hierarchies of knowledge, and also to open up a more nuanced two-way exchange of ideas, I think, and see global labor history in a more complex and interconnected way by doing so. I think that's the right way to go. And about Seth's comment question, well, I am not sure if he's still here, but Christian Strumpel, my very good friend and an excellent anthropologist of industrial work, was with us. I think he left. It's almost midnight here in Germany. I wish he was still here to help me out with this one. Yes, I really find the contemporary studies, anthropological studies of industrial work, like really, really inspiring. I mean, in general, I find ethnography like really, really inspiring, especially when you are working in this like micro scale analysis. But I mean, I try to say this in my concluding remarks. What I also find incredibly important is to revisit some forgotten kind of like scholarship. And in this case, a specific example would be the Manchester anthropological studies from the 1960s and 70s. There was a time I spent some, I think, like 2-3 months reading only those studies while writing my book, and I found them incredibly inspiring in the level of detail that they covered, but also in the sophistication of their ability to zoom in and to zoom out, you know. And I think it really gave me like inspiration and courage to sort of like just travel in between different scales of analysis. And currently anthropologists of work are also doing that, as I was trying to explain in my talk, and they are dealing with like such complicated situations, such as the coexistence of different contract forms under one roof on one production line. Like, these are incredibly legally, culturally complicated situations, and the way that they deal with that, and at the same time that they connect this to global production networks and the consumption networks, I think this is wonderful. And in general, maybe it is because I was trained as a sociologist. I came to history later in my academic career. I was trained as a sociologist. I always feel like, I mean, regardless of the time period that we write on, we should always say something about what is happening in the present. Like, I always find it almost like an imperative that like my historical work somehow connects and says something about our present day reality. And also like many of the presentist debates, such as the digital factory debate that I was talking about, that we historicize these. So the other way is also true. And I see this as a political act in itself, actually.
Okay, we have a few questions. Do you want me to repeat, or do you want to try to, do you want to first start, Benjamin? Yeah. I'm happy to repeat if you want, but
Yeah, no,
make the long walk up, roll out the red carpet.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start by echoing real quickly what Seth said. I was mesmerized by this talk, and yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Specifically, I'm studying Saxony right now, which I kept thinking, where does it fit into this geography? It went several times between global north and I guess the no man's land of Eastern Europe, and then back into the global north. So I very much sympathize with that. My question is very simple. I was wondering if you could reflect on the different semantics of work versus labor.
Oh.
Hi, thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just like conscious about like my volume. But thank you so much for your really incredible talk. I took so I took a lot of notes. I have two questions. The first is sort of thinking about the relationship between a project of writing labor history from the global south with those instances or those contexts that have been shaped by colonialism but do not fully sort of like identify themselves with the project of the third world or of the global south. So here I'm thinking, for instance, of the massive sort of like transformations in East Asia over like the past half century, and how a lot of like historians, for instance, of the four Asian tigers would not really identify as like part of this sort of like project of histories of the global south, but nonetheless are still dealing with like materials that are profoundly shaped by histories of like colonialism and imperialism, right? So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about like how one might think of like the utility of a framework like the global south in contexts like those. The second is to what extent does a project of like writing global labor history presume a theory of capitalism? And to what extent do scholars working on labor history from the global south should enter into like conversation with like the new sort of like historiography around like capitalism that's emerged out of like theories of racial capitalism, for instance, or historians working within the tradition of like new history of capitalism? Thanks a lot.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I'm gonna bow, is that the thing? You're a great expert. Just because you ended on a kind of an activist note and a kind of charge for taking this work further, my question is that in some circles, there's a tendency to bemoan the decline of labor history, and they usually attribute that to, variously in a vulgar way, the rise of postmodernism, the rise of deconstruction and post-colonial studies. Some even go further and point to the rise of gender studies, environmental studies, queer studies. And the argument they make is that it's because of these other disciplines or sort of debates that this has displaced labor history from its position of importance. I'm wondering how you interpret this scholarly shift or decline. Be as polemical as you want. I think we all have positions on this kind of a thing. I'm curious from an expert how you read that.
I think go ahead with those unless we have one more, we might be able to squeeze one in, but I think go ahead and answer those, Görkem.
These are really difficult questions, or is it too late in Germany? Am I getting I find these questions really, really hard. I now realize what kind of like trouble I put myself in by being like so provocative. You are provoked. That's nice, but I wasn't planning this part of it. Anyways, the semantics of work and labor, that's like a huge topic, isn't it? But obviously, like work is not labor. Labor is a term in political economy. It's an economic relationship that defines exploitation and oppression of working people. But like, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind when you asked this question is like something that I actually wanted to talk about today, but I just couldn't fit it in, and I didn't want to go over my time. I was thinking about how global labor history has almost no engagement with social reproduction theory. I find it like, I mean, obviously, like there is quite a bit of like critique of global labor history from a feminist point of view. Like we have people like Dorothy Sue Cobble saying that global labor history has been fetishizing commodification, and that it doesn't pay enough attention to non-commodified forms of labor. And yeah, like just prioritizing basically the market aspect of labor. And then you have yeah, like people saying that feminist historians are still knocking at the doors, basically, of global labor history. And this I actually also experienced firsthand a while ago when I wrote a piece on women's labor, and we had like with my co-author, we had a long debate whether we should like publish it in a global labor history journal or in a women and gender history journal. And like we were kind of like annoyed how the distinction between the two was like so much out there, you know, like it was so pronounced. And then you have people really pushing for bringing this kind of insights. Like I can think of, at the top of my hand, I can think of a very recent, quite recent article by Eileen Boris and Kristen Swint, published in the International Review of Social History, where they asked the question, how does the history of capitalism look different if you start from the household, you know? But the thing is that, like, although you have this like very powerful, very convincing voices now, like from time to time within global labor history publications, it seems like, as I mean, the field as a whole has not been much influenced by that. So your question on semantics made me think about this. I don't know if this is anything useful or interesting for you, but I was thinking of that. And then the second question about capitalism within global labor history, that's also like a big discussion, isn't it? I mean, yeah, on the one hand, there is, as you suggested, the new history of capitalism approach. And I don't know, maybe Seth wants to jump in and say something about this later on, but I have read quite a bit about that debate, and I find some value in what is happening there in terms of like bringing back political economy to our discussions. Yeah, of course. But it's also like a bit of a problem, I think, in terms of making global labor history a field which is already very much focusing on structures, if you ask me, even pushing it in that direction more, whereas I think we should be maybe careful in keeping the focus on agency as well. So this is also something that comes up with what I mentioned in my talk, with this new critical evaluations or the suggestions for combining microhistory with global labor history. You would find like resonations of that in that discussion as well. But if you ask me, I mean, it should be central, but it should be central in a way that sort of like balances the overemphasis on structure with an emphasis on agency. And postmodernism and labor history, yeah, I mean, we have discussed that quite a bit, no? And I think especially before the emergence of global labor history, or even after that, we had what an author said, I like this, like a serial of obituaries for labor history, like the many deaths of a field, you know? But I mean, that sort of like is now in the past, I feel. The other day I was just thinking to myself, during my PhD years, which was like between 2007 and 2012, I remember reading so many studies, many books on women's work. And after a while, I was thinking they all almost had the same first chapter, because this was like the heyday of deconstruction and postmodernism. And I remembered like the main chapters, the empirical chapters, most of the time they didn't fit with what the authors were saying in their introductions or first chapters about, oh, there is no materiality to labor history. Like, well, there is. I mean, you show it in your empirical chapters. So I think this is now a thing of the past now. I mean, in terms of our discussion and also in terms of our practice. I think now we are facing another danger. We are like, I mean, it's a very difficult time to be a labor historian, but it's also a very difficult time to be an academic because of, I mean, precarity and the pressure to publish. So this like last bit of my talk where I was talking about our discussions within global labor history becoming too particularistic, becoming too inward looking. I think one can say this about many other disciplines. It's not just our problem today. And it has a lot to do with the dynamics of the labor or the job market, academic job market. So I think that is more of a problem today than all this like postmodernism. Did it kill the political potential or the political energy, dynamism of our field kind of discussions? Yeah.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but if someone has a burning question, we can put it in. Okay, thank you so much for joining us at such a late hour. We wish you were here with us in person.
Thank you so much for having me and for accommodating this situation. It was like a pleasure to talk to you, and I wish you like very interesting discussions and nice social time together.
Thank you.